Hey, everybody, thank you for coming. I really appreciate your time, and the subject that we wanted to talk about today is a subject I think that is the top of everybody's mind in healthcare, interoperability. And strangely enough, it's been the top of everybody's mind for about the last 15 or 20 years. So this year is just like every other year. There are a number of questions that have come in to be able to address during the session. So how do we start getting right to those and see if we can't start to clear some things up and hopefully advance the whole interoperability issue inside of healthcare?
Thanks, John. So one of the first questions we got in is, what do you think are the hurdles to achieving interoperability?
You know, a lot of the hurdles are self-inflicted. When you come right down to it, there are a lot of commercial interests, and I get those commercial interests, but those things start to be able to make interoperability more difficult. You have no real standards on data sharing. You know, a number of different large EHR companies think that they have their standard, but those standards don't necessarily translate when they try and speak to each other. You've got issues like patient identifiers. How can we make sure that a patient in one system is the same as a patient in another system? Different ways that HCOs want to admit patients, different ways that those patients are filed in their EHR systems and even in HIE systems. There are a number of hurdles and a number of impediments, and not the least of which is a number of different communication protocols that are being used in the marketplace right now, and the fact that those don't necessarily interact well with each other.
Second question we got in is, what's the most important way documents are shared amongst providers today?
You know, interestingly enough, and I know that those of us that are attending patients every day realize this, that fax is ubiquitous in healthcare. It was an interesting stat that I saw recently when Direct Trust announced that they've just sent their 1 billionth direct message. The reason that that's interesting is the large fax providers send 1 billion faxes every year. And in fact, those large fax providers are even a portion of fax, because many of the providers that are still in practice today use fax machines. Really, 75% of the information that's being sent around patients, patient data, PHI, is sent via fax. And fax is the largest communication protocol in use. You know, after fax, you've got HL7, many versions of HL7. Fire tends to be the drink of choice these days, but you still have other dialects, if you will, of HL7 that are being used very commonly. And finally, secure direct messaging, direct via Direct Trust. Those are really the three that are most common in use. Fax first, HL7, and direct.
So what is the difference between sending and receiving cloud faxes and direct message? That's the next question.
Well, you know, faxing is a very specific protocol that allows you to send and receive documents that are rendered as a document, usually a PDF in your EHR. When you use direct messaging allows you to receive CCDAs that can be consumed. It's data that is structured for an EHR, as opposed to data that's unstructured, which is in a fax. You know, the good news is that we have recently brought to market a product that actually combines both protocols. So whether you're faxing or whether you're using direct, you can get information from one provider to another provider securely. That platform is called Consensus. And with the Consensus platform, the ability to send either structured data via direct or unstructured data in the form of a form or a written document can also be handled over the same platform.
Next question, if I still use paper files and I don't have an EHR, how can I get access to this patient data?
That's always been tough. And I get it. A lot of practices, a lot of healthcare settings, especially if you get into rural areas, you get into economically impacted urban areas, the kind of equipment, the kind of systems, these are difficult to afford. So very often you have somebody who's working with just a fax machine or a simple computer but not an EHR. What the choice is there is either to have difficulty communicating or to move to a platform that can facilitate the ability to move electronic information without needing an EHR. And in fact, the platform that I mentioned a little bit earlier, Consensus, is able to work in the presence of or without an EHR and allow providers to electronically exchange information, whether using fax protocol or direct protocol. In fact, that same provider who in the past has had to rely on receiving faxes for patients who may have been discharged from a hospital or patients that are going through some kind of acute episode, those PCPs who would be sitting there with just a fax machine would have to call up hospitals, ask to get records, have to manually involve themselves in the process. With the Consensus platform, they can actually query those patient records without an EHR and receive them electronically to their computing device without needing to make any kind of special investment in systems. So, the world is changing, and it's changing for the better, and it's starting to draw in those practitioners who, in the past, haven't been able to participate.
You mentioned interoperability standards earlier. What's the latest interoperability-based standard for sharing healthcare data?
The latest standard is something called the FHIR in the industry. It's FHIR, or Fast Health Internet Resources. And what FHIR is actually a derivative of Health Language 7, or HL7. And it's a very specific derivative that narrows the field a little bit. HL7 is a fairly wide framework. FHIR starts to get much more specific on how data is exchanged, and it's really emerged as the preferred way to do that. And in fact, I believe the new rule just released by CMS is requiring that all data use for the U.S. core data for interoperability, or the U.S. CDI, including clinical notes, allergies, and medications, is transferred via FHIR. So I guess as much as anything, FHIR can be called the standard for digital transfer of information when it's structured data. Far and away, though, fax is still the winning standard when we're talking about the lion's share of data and unstructured data. And by the way, Consensus, that platform I mentioned earlier, supports both.
Next question. What does it mean to have data that goes in different directions, bi-directional data?
Well, and that's important because really sending things one way is not really the idea of an exchange of data. So bi-directional really means that you can both send and receive data from the same data source and be able to truly exchange as opposed to just send or just receive.
You mentioned integration of data into my EHR, and I have an EHR. If I am using an EHR, how does cloud faxing work?
Well, cloud faxing is a way of getting a document from point A to point B. If you're using an EHR, it's very common for an EHR to use a product like eFax to receive a document electronically and then route that document, or in fact take the first few steps in a workflow to say, okay, this document is coming from a lab. I need to put it in a queue to be verified. This document is coming from another provider and it's a transition of care. I need to put that in a particular place in an EHR. If the data is identifiable to the patient or physician level, in fact, it can be routed. So if you're thinking about how a fax via cloud fax is received by somebody with an EHR, that reception is very much like any other message that comes into the EHR. You apply some rules to it, you get it to where it needs to go, and it renders as a human readable document.
All right, next question. I'm mainly using faxing, paper faxing. How hard is it for me to move the workflow from paper faxing to cloud faxing and to direct messaging?
In fact, it's really easy to do, and there are a number of advantages to this. I would start with just the simple transition from a paper faxing environment to a cloud faxing environment. And what you're doing is introducing an electronic workflow into an environment while you're still providing what's been a tried and true, trusted way of exchanging information. The other really important thing when you move from paper to cloud fax is you start to introduce a much greater level of security. So if you're thinking about cloud fax, right away you're eliminating paper. And as you know, keeping paper locked down in a clinical environment is a difficult thing to do. You also are creating a way of ensuring that you can apply security standards to that transaction. In other words, and I'll use eFax as an example, you've got a high trust certified HIPAA compliant method of exchanging information within a clinical setting or between clinical settings, not rendering in paper, not leaving a secure environment, and being able to be filed into an EHR or sent electronically within an organization without ever having it printed out. And that's a big step forward, really, for a lot of practices, getting rid of that paper, creating a secure environment, and putting in place a process for thinking of workflows electronically rather than paper-based. Now, you can take a further step and you can say, okay, going from a fax to something like a direct message. Once you've got an electronic workflow, I think you're going to find that most practices start to get comfortable with direct and are able to see the value of exchanging structured information. So while we can do certain things with an electronic fax in terms of workflow streamlining, those things get even further down the road with a secure direct message, because when you're dealing with structured data, in other words, you're dealing with data that you know certain fields are going to appear certain ways and you can read them and interpret them, then you start to be able to take that information and get it to a very specific spot inside an EHR, right down to a patient's name, a provider's name, an exact kind of test, a certain kind of script. All of those kinds of things start to be able to be determined when you introduce direct. And the big transition going from paper to an electronic transaction via cloud fax opens the door to taking the next step. And one of the nice things about that continuum is that if you're working with a platform that supports all of those various kinds of protocols, like Consensus, for example, it gives you the opportunity to move through that at your own speed. One of the interesting things about Consensus that I've learned that it does is, in fact, be able to tell a provider who has a regular partner that they fax with. Suppose a provider regularly faxes with a large academic medical center that's in the vicinity and generally faxes to a certain fax number. This program Consensus, the platform, can actually let that provider know, hey, did you know that this fax number actually has a direct address that's associated with it, and you can send it direct instead. By just knowing that, you start to create a better way of sharing information that is going to be more useful both for the provider who's sending as well as the entity that's receiving.
If it's this easy to move from paper to cloud faxing, why are so many providers still using paper faxes?
Oh my, change is hard. Uh, you know, it's very difficult for people who are comfortable doing something one way to change and do it another, and we understand that. So when you're introducing something like an electronic workflow, the most common objection I have heard is specifically that, look, you know, an electronic system is going to cost me more. I own my fax machine. And when you come right down to it, and what we've shown time and time again, is that if you start to add up simple things like the cost of a phone line, which is a component of keeping that fax machine going, the cost of paper, the cost of toner, the cost of having somebody have to run back and forth to the fax machine or stand over the fax machine to make sure that the fax goes through, because as you get larger and larger patient records, you have to actually make sure that that patient record, all of the pages have gone through the machine. You've got losses of time, you've got money running out of the practice, and being able to prove to somebody the economic value, the immediate payback you get from just implementing something like cloud fax is really the game changer. And frankly, if you're able to take 5 or 10 minutes and walk somebody through it, they understand it, and then the transition becomes easier. The reason to change becomes more evident. It's really about getting the time to be able to point that out to people.
I'm having issues with my EHR vendor and connecting to my community exchange. Can Consensus do that so that I can get additional patient data from the community exchange?
You know, when you're dealing with something like an EHR and you're dealing with something like a community exchange, it starts to get difficult to cut through some of the friction that sometimes occurs in those sorts of relationships. You know, the APIs that Consensus has can connect directly to community exchanges, so in many ways you can start to remove some of that friction and populate HIEs with your information as well as to get data back from the HIE. So there is a way for Consensus to start to make that a much smoother kind of transaction.
I don't use an EHR, but use a document management storage platform. Can I still use some of the interoperability technologies in Consensus to populate my patient records that are stored in a document system?
You know, it's really the biggest leap forward for providers who don't have an EHR system to be able to start the process of doing electronic exchange. And you know, you don't need an EHR to use Consensus. EHRs are expensive. EHRs sometimes take people who have a good understanding of computers to run. With Consensus, you would simply use a very intuitive dashboard. You can send and receive documents. You can send and receive electronic direct messages, and you can also query a network of patient information through Commonwealth and through Care Quality. So all of those opportunities are now open to folks who previously didn't have them because they didn't have an EHR. You can do it with Consensus.
Next question. Can I get access to payer claims data from Consensus?
Yeah, that's for Consensus, that's a next step. And I don't think it's too far behind. As everybody knows, payer claim data is an important component of being able to piece together the overall journey of a patient, and having that key piece of information is something that we're dedicated to pursuing and bringing into the platform.
Next question. What does it mean to query to find a patient, and what kind of patient information do I need to have to find that patient?
Yeah, the tough thing is that I know that there are many systems out there that create patient identifiers. Very often those patient identifiers don't match. The beauty of what Consensus does is it really works with demographic information. Name, address, age, very common items of personal information that when you put them together can really identify a person without question. And by using demographic information rather than numeric patient identifiers, you're able to open up a broader opportunity for providers to be able to query patient records. You don't need to know an exact patient identifier in order to get that patient's information. If you've got a sufficient amount of demographic information that patient can be accurately identified, you can pull a record back from one of those systems into the Consensus platform.
What will the new data rule from CMS and ONC do to help promote interoperability?
Well, the rule was thoughtful in an impressive number of areas. The technology to share data has existed. There have been impediments around that, sometimes imposed by commercial interests, sometimes imposed because people were concerned about privacy. Those kinds of things are starting to be moved away when you think of the new rule from CMS. The requirement to be able to share data without having to be charged for it. The electronic notification of transitions of care. There are requirements in that rule that really drive the marketplace towards being able to share data in a way that is less frightening, less scary, less concern about, is this a reasonable way to share private information? Is this a reasonable way to, am I allowed to send this to the hospital? Am I allowed to send this to the PCP? CMS is trying to clear that fog, and I think that this rule is starting to do a pretty good job of it. And all of those new provisions that are in the rule are provisions that can be supported by Consensus. So I think that for most of the audience, the idea of being able to have a single platform where all of these needs can be met in an easy and simple way is probably something that most people would be interested in, and you can learn more at the Consensus website at consensus.com. And in fact, from a question and answer point of view, if there's any other questions that will come in later, or any member of the audience wants to submit questions directly to the Consensus site, you can email info@consensus.com.